Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. So I'm back on my 80s comedy kick. This time with the classic, the seminal Three Men and a Baby. Admittedly, like so many, I suppose, era-defining films of the 80s, this is a film that theoretically I should have seen, being a 90s baby, growing up with a lot of these sorts of films sort of around, particularly what you might call the Sunday afternoon fare. And yet, for whatever reason, like so many before that I've mentioned, I've never seen Three Men and a Baby. And for what it's worth, I understand, I suppose, on some level, why, I appreciate why it's held in such great esteem. And at the same time, it's difficult because I don't want to be too analytical about it, even though, of course, that's almost the core function of this project. But I suppose on a simple level, I appreciate why this would people would endear to a film such as this. But at the same time, sort of taking apart the cinematic mechanics, I also kind of look at it with sort of intrigue and say, well, on some level, this really shouldn't have worked. Because, I mean, I was saying before the film started, because I didn't know that this was a Leonard Nimoy directed film. And I said it, in terms of Leonard Nimoy's career, especially as someone who, of course, was an actor who then went into directing and never quite sort of carved out his oeuvre. Not to say he wasn't successful as a director, but simply he never shaped a career so that people will go, oh, this is a Leonard Nimoy film. I suppose an authorship. And so it's curious because I suppose on some level a film like, of course I know he directed at least one Star Trek. I don't know if he did two potentially. And of course Three Men and a Baby. And on some level Three Men and a Baby might be almost his sort of directorial crowning achievement, because on some level you wouldn't notice necessarily that it is his film. You don't watch the film and think, oh, this is directed by the guy who was in Star Trek, and I think that's to his credit. It feels like a John Hughes film. And for a long time I did genuinely, I've always assumed it was a John Hughes film, but then I think there's a certain aesthetic of that era that, of course, without foreknowledge, one would just assume, this sort of soft focus, light comedy, light sort of American comedy, mostly set in New York. One would assume, John Hughes or John Hughes adjacent. And yet I imagine that this, were it to line up, the classics of this era, most of them probably, this was just a sort of house style of the time, because people appreciated this kind of sitcom style setup. As I was saying, the mechanics of it are curious, because frankly this almost reads like a pilot, and not even a particularly good TV pilot. Of course the premise of three men for a series of convoluted reasons end up having to take care of a child whilst protecting the child or protecting themselves from the law and circumstance. You can see it being sort of pitched at that level where the first episode would be very 80s sitcom. Of course, I couldn't help but think about Full House for a lot of the film, which is very much in that same structure. yes, it's more than just three men looking after a child. It's about three men looking after twin daughters, but and the rest of the household, whatever that whole dynamic. But it is in that same ilk, and of course, it I suppose works on that framework that, of course, there is that relationship between, I suppose, three bachelor boys, very 80s styles, or at least 80s influence, sort of, free roaming men who live this sort of urban dream scenario. And of course, they have great chemistry together, but they like the fact that they are free spirits. And then, of course, because of circumstance, they have to come together to do a task that is quite outside of their normal remit, and of course, it shifts their lives. And I suppose what I like about the first section of the film, particularly the party and the post party, is the fact that the film doesn't try to paint their lives as hugely, because they are young bachelors, it doesn't try to paint them as hugely happy and contented, and and this is throwing a spanner into the lives of people who into young men who want their freedom. There is this strange melancholy that almost resides over the first section of the film. I mean, with Tom Selleck, it's the fact that he, has this girlfriend, but they agreed, and, a sort of relationship arrangement that works for them, but then it leaves him with a sense of dissatisfaction. You've got Steve Guttenberg, who is romantically incompetent, and so therefore, again, sort of feels that, the absence because of that. And then, of course, you've got Ted Danson, who is very much your wild card guy who thinks that what he wants is the party lifestyle with the women and the all the things that come along with sort of being an actor and someone who's shooting to the top, as it were. And yet, of course, that's also masking that sense of something missing. And of course, narratively speaking, the easy fix for them is the fact that they end up with this child that they didn't choose, and they don't realise they want, but of course it changes them, and they learn that actually she fills an absence in their lives that they knew was there but refused to acknowledge, and it changes them as people. And you think, well, yeah, on a level, this really works, because and it's remarkable, I suppose, that it hadn't existed before. Well, with the exception of the original French film that this is adapted from. But I suppose it only really worked. It couldn't have existed before the 80s. Perhaps. I'm thinking about sort of the Marx Brothers or the Three Stooges having that. Maybe that could have worked for their kind of comedy stylings, but this very much is a commentary on a certain era and a certain type of masculinity. And unfortunately, like I say, the mechanics of the film, there are challenges where I think, I can see that this needed to be in place, but unfortunately it doesn't work. Like, for instance, the prototypical criminal subplot where, to drive the story forward, there needs to be some kind of crime-based or organised crime-based event that, as well as the circumstances that the characters are dealing with, in this case the child, they also have to navigate the fact that they're dealing with gangsters or criminals. And I don't know if because I consider it cliched, particularly 80s cliched, because there are so many films, 80s and 90s, that do that, where they throw in a crime subplot to almost, because they don't feel like there's almost a lack of faith in their core premise, or it's just because it's an easy way to motivate the plot forward, because it means this other thing is going on. and it detracts for me, especially because it needs to be written out, and in this case it gets written out in the second act, and it, rather unceremoniously, is just no longer relevant to the story, which means, of course, from a narrative structure, you think, well, if it's not relevant to the body of the story, it shouldn't be relevant at all, you know. And yeah, like I say, watching it's funny enough, it's amusing enough, but it's not an out-and-out comedy. Of course, it relies on the sort of incompetence of the main characters and the idea of three bachelors not coping with being instant fathers. And I was concerned because I was thinking about an article I read weeks ago, about how the British Film Institute is will no longer contribute or support financially films that play into gender stereotypes. And in the case of sort of this side of storytelling, it means that the idea of the incompetent male sort of parent, and I hugely support that, because of course that is a stereotype, and it's not. It's a very poor, uninteresting type character model that, frankly, is rather old-fashioned and is just as sexist as, you know, the idea that women are naturally maternal. And what I like about it, and when watching this, of course, going in, I was concerned that that's what we were going to get. But, of course, within the mechanics of the film, it's not that these are incompetent fathers, these are incompetent bachelors who were forced into fatherhood quite suddenly. And they even go so far as to have a female character who is not maternal. And I think that, again, deserves plaudit, because it does break gender conventions, so that by the end of the film you have three men who are incredibly paternal, but it feels natural to their characters. As I say, there are aspects of the story that I do think are a little weaker than they can be, and a little cheesy and saccharine, and it, like I say, it does rely on almost a sitcom-y style to it, and it's not, even if I'm being totally honest, that funny. It's not a particularly strong comedy. The comedy comes from the sort of slapstick of them trying to cope with instant parenthood. But in saying that, there is something very watchable about it. I mean, perhaps it's the chemistry of the leads. I mean, they do have great chemistry. The three of them together, although particularly Tom Selleck and Steve Guttenberg, there's just a natural frisson between them that is very watchable, and it means that they balance the right level of sort of humour with sincere emotion, because of course, thinking about what I said earlier about, you know, imagining this in the sort of hands of someone like the Marx Brothers or the Stooges, that of course it would lean into the comedy, but then you would question, well, will it have the sincerity? And the film does have the sincerity, so that you genuinely care about the fact that these guys develop an attachment to this baby, and I think that deserves appreciation. You know, it like I say, it's not the strongest drama and it's not the funniest comedy, but somewhere in that middle ground, I actually found it a very sweet-natured film, and yeah, very, very watchable. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because it's all helping the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications for when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 250 videos. And follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films. And I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.